HOA Karen kept knocking over my trash can, so I installed one she definitely didn't see coming. Before we dive into today's story, I'd like to ask you one quick favor. Tell me where you're watching from by leaving the name of your city or country in the comments below. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel, and I truly appreciate every one of you for being here. Now, without any further delay, let me tell you exactly how this all began. People like to believe the truth always announces itself. It doesn't. Sometimes it rolls quietly down a suburban street at 6:17 every Tuesday morning, hidden behind the low growl of a white Cadillac Escalade and the sharp crack of another plastic trash can hitting the pavement. My name is Ethan Walker, and for almost a month, that sound had become as predictable as sunrise. Every Tuesday, just minutes before the garbage truck reached my side of Pine Creek Estates, my trash can somehow ended up lying on its side, its lid halfway across the driveway, coffee grounds, cereal boxes, and grocery bags scattered across the concrete like someone had dumped the contents there on purpose. The first time it happened, I blamed the wind. The second time, I assumed the sanitation crew had been careless. By the third week, I knew neither explanation made any sense because there wasn't enough wind to move an empty paper cup, and the garbage truck hadn't even reached my house yet. Every Tuesday, the mess appeared before the collectors arrived. Every Tuesday, someone beat them to it. Pine Creek Estates looked exactly like the kind of neighborhood real estate agents loved to photograph. Fresh sidewalks, identical mailboxes, perfectly trimmed lawns, flower beds that somehow managed to bloom on schedule every season. It was the kind of place where people waved from their driveways, but usually knew far more about each other's business than they admitted. I had lived there for 6 years with my 2 kids, Lily and Noah, after my divorce. We kept mostly to ourselves. I worked as a civil engineer about 30 minutes outside town, left early every morning, came home before dinner, fixed things around the house on weekends, and tried to raise my children without turning every disagreement into a neighborhood spectacle. That was probably why Vanessa Holloway decided I was an easy target. Vanessa chaired the HOA compliance committee with the kind of enthusiasm most people reserved for winning the lottery. She knew every mailbox regulation, every landscaping requirement, every parking restriction, and she seemed personally offended whenever someone else's property looked even slightly different from the picture in her mind. I'd received notices because my recycling bin stayed outside an hour too long after pickup, because a delivery box sat on my porch overnight, and once because my lawn measured nearly half an inch taller than the community guideline after 3 straight days of heavy rain. I paid the small fines when they appeared, filed polite appeals when they seemed unreasonable, and moved on with my life. Fighting over every little thing simply wasn't worth the energy. At least, that's what I believed back then. That Tuesday morning started exactly like all the others. Fresh coffee in my hand, the faint smell of wet grass drifting through the open garage, birds making enough noise to drown out the distant traffic beyond the subdivision entrance. Then I heard it. A hollow plastic bang followed by the scraping sound of wheels dragging across concrete. I stepped outside before I even realized I had put my coffee mug down. My black trash can lay upside down near the curb, the lid resting against my mailbox while garbage spread across the driveway in every direction. A few crows had already landed nearby as if they knew breakfast had just been served. I looked up instinctively, just in time to catch the back end of a white Escalade turning the corner at the end of the street. The brake lights flashed once. Then it disappeared. Most people would have cleaned up the mess, grumbled for a few minutes, and forgotten about it before lunch. I almost did exactly that. But as I picked up another torn grocery bag and noticed the same fresh tire marks cutting across the edge of the curb for what had to be the 4th Tuesday in a row, something finally shifted in my mind. Accidents don't happen on a schedule. Habits do. And the moment I realized someone had turned knocking over my trash can into part of their weekly routine, I stopped seeing myself as the victim of bad luck. I started paying attention instead. The next Tuesday, I left for work 20 minutes later than usual, not because I was running behind, but because I wanted to see whether my growing suspicion had any weight behind it. The air still carried the cool scent of damp mulch from the flower beds lining the sidewalks, and the automatic sprinklers had only just shut off, leaving tiny beads of water sparkling across the perfectly trimmed lawns that Pine Creek Estates took so much pride in. Everything looked peaceful. That was the strange thing about neighborhoods like ours. The prettier everything appeared on the surface, the easier it became for people to hide petty behavior behind polite smiles. I stood just inside my garage with the lights off, holding my coffee and pretending to organize a toolbox whenever someone drove past. At exactly 6:16, I heard the familiar rumble of a large sport utility vehicle approaching from the west entrance. A second later, the white Cadillac Escalade rolled into view at an almost casual speed. Vanessa Holloway sat behind the wheel wearing oversized sunglasses despite the early morning light. She slowed slightly as she approached my driveway. Her front tire drifted closer to the curb than necessary. Then came the sound I had already memorized. Plastic scraped concrete. My trash can rocked once before tipping completely over, spilling everything across the edge of the street. The Escalade never stopped. It simply continued around the corner as if nothing unusual had happened. I waited several seconds before walking outside. There were fresh tire marks crossing the same section of curb again. The angle was nearly identical to the marks from the previous weeks. I looked up and down the street. Curtains moved inside two nearby homes. Someone had seen it. I could feel it. But nobody stepped outside. Nobody said a word. That afternoon, after work, I knocked on the door of my next-door neighbor, Tom Reynolds. Tom had lived there longer than almost anyone else in the subdivision. He was retired, friendly, and usually spent his mornings tending tomato plants in his backyard. When I casually asked whether he had ever noticed anything unusual on trash collection days, he hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Finally, he sighed. "Ethan, people have noticed more than they talk about." I waited. He glanced toward the street before lowering his voice. "Vanessa has a habit of making examples out of people she thinks do not respect the community rules. By knocking over trash cans?" I asked. He gave a small shrug. "Nobody wants trouble with the homeowners association." That answer bothered me more than I expected. Not because it confirmed my suspicion, but because everyone seemed to accept it as normal. Over the next several days, I started paying attention to things I had ignored before. Vanessa seemed to patrol the neighborhood constantly. If someone parked a pickup truck overnight, a violation notice appeared the next morning. If holiday decorations stayed up one day too long, another notice arrived. One afternoon, I watched her stop her vehicle in front of a neighbor's house just long enough to photograph a basketball hoop sitting near the curb before driving away. A few days later, that family received a warning letter. Patterns began appearing everywhere once I finally started looking. My own mailbox held another notice that Friday. According to the letter, my trash container had repeatedly been left in an improper position near the curb after collection, creating what the association described as an unnecessary visual disturbance. I read the sentence 3 times before laughing out loud. The very person creating the disturbance appeared to be documenting it afterward. It was almost impressive. Instead of becoming angry, I spread every notice I had ever received across my kitchen table that evening. Lily looked over my shoulder while finishing homework. "Dad," she said quietly, "why do they always pick on you?" I smiled because she deserved reassurance more than frustration. Maybe because they think I will never push back. She nodded thoughtfully before returning to her math book. That simple conversation stayed with me long after everyone went to bed. Vanessa believed she understood exactly how I would react. She expected annoyance. She expected another cleanup. She expected silence. What she did not expect was patience. By the following Monday, I had purchased 2 small outdoor security cameras that blended almost perfectly into the trim around my garage. They were legal, discreet, and pointed entirely at my own property. I installed them before sunset, tested every viewing angle twice, and checked the timestamps until everything matched down to the second. Then I went inside and waited for Tuesday morning, not hoping the routine would stop, but quietly counting on the fact that people rarely abandon a habit they believe has no consequences. The first Tuesday after I installed the cameras arrived with the same quiet rhythm that had defined every other morning in Pine Creek Estates. The coffee maker finished brewing before sunrise. The kitchen smelled faintly of toasted bread and dark roast coffee, while the neighborhood outside still looked half asleep beneath a pale orange sky. I checked the camera feeds one last time on my phone before slipping it into my pocket. Every angle was clear. The driveway, the curb, the mailbox, the trash can. Nothing moved except a pair of squirrels chasing each other across the oak tree near the sidewalk. At exactly 6:16, the familiar sound drifted toward the house again. A large engine. Smooth. Confident, unhurried. I remained inside the garage with the side door cracked open just enough to hear everything without being seen. The white Escalade entered the frame precisely as it had the week before. Vanessa never looked toward my house. She looked straight ahead with one hand resting casually on the steering wheel, almost as though she had performed the same motion so many times that it no longer required thought. Her vehicle eased closer to the curb. The front tire crossed the painted edge by several inches. Then came the unmistakable scrape, followed by the hollow crash of plastic rolling across concrete. The trash can tipped over exactly as before. A banana peel landed near the mailbox. An empty cereal box slid into the gutter. The Escalade continued down the street without slowing, disappearing around the corner before the garbage truck even entered the neighborhood. I waited another minute before walking outside. Instead of cleaning the mess immediately, I opened the camera application. The video was crystal clear. The timestamp matched down to the second. More importantly, the footage showed something I had not expected. As Vanessa's front wheel drifted toward the curb, she turned her head briefly toward my driveway before making contact with the trash can. It was only a second, but it was enough to suggest awareness rather than coincidence. I replayed the clip several times that evening. Then I compared it with the recording from the following Tuesday. The approach speed was nearly identical. The angle was nearly identical. Even the position of her vehicle relative to the mailbox differed by less than a foot. Years of engineering had taught me that random events rarely produce identical results over and over again. Repetition creates patterns, and patterns tell stories. By the end of the month, I had assembled 4 separate recordings, each one documenting the same sequence within a window of less than 15 seconds. I created a simple spreadsheet listing the date, the exact time, weather conditions, vehicle direction, and the position of the tire relative to the curb. It looked less like a complaint and more like the beginning of a field study. Numbers have a way of removing emotion from an argument, and I wanted facts, not frustration. Out of curiosity, I stopped by the local police station after work one afternoon and asked whether repeated property interference like this could be reported. The officer behind the desk watched one of the videos without interrupting. When it finished, he leaned back thoughtfully. "This definitely looks intentional," he admitted. "But unless there is measurable property damage or another related violation, it is difficult for us to pursue it as more than a neighborhood dispute. Keep documenting everything." That advice turned out to be exactly what I needed to hear. I was no longer looking for someone else to solve the problem. I simply needed confirmation that patience was the right strategy. Over the next week, I noticed something else. Every violation letter I received from the Homeowners Association arrived within 24 hours after trash collection. Somehow Vanessa always seemed to know my trash can had been left overturned long enough to justify another written warning. The timing felt almost too perfect. I spread the letters across my dining room table beside printed still images from the security cameras. Lily walked past, glanced at the photographs, and quietly said, "She keeps creating the picture that she complains about." I looked up at my daughter and smiled because she had summarized the entire situation in one sentence. Vanessa was manufacturing evidence against me while assuming nobody would ever examine how that evidence appeared in the first place. That realization changed everything. I stopped thinking about proving she had knocked over my trash can. Instead, I started thinking about why she had become so comfortable repeating the same mistake over and over again. The answer was surprisingly simple. She believed nobody would ever make her explain it. Once I stopped asking whether Vanessa was doing it on purpose, a different question took its place. Why was she so confident that nothing would ever change? The answer became clearer every time I watched the recordings. She had repeated the exact same routine for weeks, because every previous week had rewarded her. She knocked over the trash can, drove away, and by the afternoon another violation notice somehow found its way into my mailbox. From her perspective, the system worked perfectly. She created the problem, then punished me for living with the result. I could have forwarded the videos to the Homeowners Association board immediately, but something held me back. I had attended enough board meetings over the years to know how those conversations usually ended. They would call it a misunderstanding. Someone would suggest both parties communicate better. The discussion would drift toward neighborhood harmony instead of accountability, and a few weeks later, I would be standing in my driveway picking up another week's garbage. No, if I wanted the truth to become impossible to ignore, I needed more than evidence. I needed certainty. That weekend became one of the busiest I had spent in my garage for months. Engineering had taught me that most problems could be solved by understanding how people interacted with physical objects. You did not have to force anyone into making a mistake if they insisted on repeating the same decision every single time. I rolled the trash container onto the garage floor and examined every hinge, wheel, and mounting point. The plastic body itself was lightweight, exactly as the city intended, but there was nothing preventing me from improving the support system beneath it as long as the container remained fully compliant with local collection requirements. I spent Saturday afternoon sketching ideas on graph paper that usually held measurements from bridge inspections and drainage projects. By evening, one design continued making more sense than the others. It did not rely on tricks. It did not damage anyone's property. It simply removed the one assumption Vanessa depended on every Tuesday morning. On Sunday, I visited a local home improvement store a few miles away. I purchased pressure-treated lumber, galvanized steel brackets, stainless steel fasteners, and a narrow concrete footing form that fit neatly into the back of my pickup truck. Every item was something any homeowner could legally buy without permits or special approval. Before unloading the materials, I checked both the city property guidelines and the homeowners association regulations one more time. Permanent landscape edging was permitted beside driveways. Decorative utility posts were permitted as long as they remained inside property boundaries. Trash containers could be positioned at the curb according to city collection schedules. Every line I read reinforced the same conclusion. There was nothing preventing me from improving my own property as long as I followed the published rules. That was exactly what I intended to do. Lily wandered into the garage while I measured distances with a tape measure stretched across the concrete floor. She looked at the sketches, then at the stack of lumber leaning against the wall. "Building something?" she asked with a smile. "Improving something," I answered. She studied my face for a moment before laughing softly. "You have that engineer look again." "What engineer look?" I asked. "The one where you already solved the problem before anyone else realizes there is one." Even Noah became curious after noticing me mixing a small batch of concrete in the backyard that afternoon. He offered to help carry tools while asking whether we were finally replacing the old trash can. "Not replacing it," I told him. "Just giving it a better place to stand." By sunset, the project looked almost disappointingly ordinary. From the street, nothing appeared unusual. The black trash container sat in nearly the exact same position it always had. The decorative edging blended naturally with the landscaping. The mounting system remained hidden from casual view, protected beneath the container and concealed by the layout of the driveway itself. Anyone walking past would have assumed nothing had changed. That was the entire point. The neighborhood settled into its usual Sunday evening quiet. Porch lights flickered on one house after another, while distant lawn mowers finally fell silent. I rinsed the last traces of concrete dust from my hands, wheeled the trash container into its familiar place near the curb, and stepped back to examine the finished result. It looked so ordinary that I almost smiled. Sometimes the strongest designs are the ones nobody notices at all. As I closed the garage for the night, I glanced once toward the corner where the white Escalade always appeared every Tuesday morning. For the first time in weeks, I was not wondering what would happen next. I was wondering how long an old habit could survive after one small detail quietly changed. Tuesday arrived with the kind of calm that only exists a few minutes before an ordinary routine changes forever. The neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Porch lights blinked off one by one. The air carried the clean scent of freshly watered lawns mixed with the faint aroma of coffee drifting from open kitchens. Somewhere farther down the block, a garage door rolled upward with its familiar mechanical hum. Everything about the morning felt comfortably predictable, which was exactly what I had been counting on. I stood inside the garage with my phone displaying the live camera feeds. The new mounting system remained completely hidden beneath the trash container. From every visible angle, nothing looked different from the previous month. The black container stood neatly beside the curb, exactly where the city required it to be. There were no warning signs, no unusual markings, nothing that would cause anyone to slow down for even a second. At precisely 6:16, the deep sound of the white Escalade echoed through the subdivision once again. My eyes never left the screen. Vanessa appeared at the end of the street, right on schedule. She drove with the same relaxed posture I had seen every Tuesday. One hand rested lightly on the steering wheel while the other held a travel mug. She was not looking for obstacles because she believed she already knew the outcome. Confidence has an interesting habit of becoming carelessness when nothing challenges it. The vehicle drifted toward the curb exactly as it always had. The front tire crossed the edge of the pavement. The bumper eased toward the side of the trash container. Then the routine reached the one detail Vanessa had never anticipated. Instead of the familiar hollow sound of lightweight plastic skidding across concrete, a short, solid thump echoed through the quiet street. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It simply sounded different, like the unmistakable difference between tapping an empty box and tapping a firmly planted fence post. The trash container did not move. It did not slide. It did not roll. It remained standing exactly where I had placed it. The Escalade stopped almost immediately several feet farther down the street. For the first time since I had begun documenting everything, Vanessa actually stepped out of her vehicle. She walked back toward the curb with a puzzled expression, looking first at the trash container and then at the front corner of her sport utility vehicle. She circled the container once, almost as though she expected to discover some obvious explanation hiding in plain sight. There was none. She glanced toward my house, unaware that the security cameras had captured every second from multiple angles. Without saying a word, she returned to the driver's seat, backed away carefully, and continued driving out of the neighborhood at a noticeably slower speed than usual. Only after her vehicle disappeared did I walk outside. The trash container stood perfectly upright. Even the lid remained closed. The decorative edging surrounding the concealed support looked exactly as it had the night before. I bent down to inspect everything closely. The mounting hardware remained secure. The concrete footing had not shifted even a fraction of an inch. The design had performed exactly as intended because it had never been built to stop a vehicle. It had simply been built to keep a trash container where it already belonged. Tom Reynolds appeared from across the street, holding his morning newspaper beneath one arm. He looked first at the trash container, then toward the corner where the Escalade had disappeared. A slow smile spread across his face. "Looks like your trash can finally decided to stay put," he said. I smiled politely. "Seems that way." He nodded once before heading back toward his porch without asking another question. He understood more than he was willing to say out loud. Later that afternoon, while reviewing the footage frame by frame, I noticed something I had missed in real time. Just before the vehicle reached the curb, Vanessa had glanced toward my driveway exactly as she had every previous week. It was the same movement, the same timing, the same expectation. The only thing that had changed was the result. Habits can survive almost anything except reality. By early evening, another envelope from the Homeowners Association appeared in my mailbox. This time, however, it was different. There was no violation notice inside. Instead, it informed me that a representative from the Compliance Committee wished to inspect a recent modification near my driveway later that week. I read the letter twice before setting it beside the stack of previous notices on my kitchen table. For weeks, Vanessa had believed she was controlling the story. She still did not realize that every step she took now would only create another page in a record she could no longer rewrite. The inspection notice arrived on a Thursday, but nobody from the Homeowners Association appeared that morning. Instead, a county building inspector pulled into my driveway just after 9 o'clock in an official pickup truck with the department logo printed across the doors. That immediately caught my attention because homeowners associations could complain all they wanted, but they could not order county inspections without filing an actual request. The inspector introduced himself as Daniel Brooks, shook my hand, and explained that someone had reported an unauthorized fixed structure interfering with public sanitation access. His voice carried no accusation, only routine professionalism. I invited him to look at anything he wanted. We walked slowly down the driveway while he measured distances with a tape and compared them against a digital copy of the municipal property standards on his tablet. He examined the decorative edging, checked the setback from the sidewalk, inspected the concealed support system beneath the trash container, and even verified that the sanitation truck could still reach the container without obstruction. The entire inspection lasted less than 20 minutes. When he finished, he smiled politely and closed his tablet. "Everything here appears to comply with county code," he said. "Your installation remains entirely on private property, and nothing interferes with collection services." I thanked him for taking the time to verify everything. Before leaving, He added one sentence that stayed with me. You would be surprised how often complaints disappear once the facts are documented. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from one of the security cameras. I opened the live feed and immediately recognized the white Escalade slowing near the curb. Vanessa stepped out carrying a clipboard and a folder tucked beneath one arm. She looked around the street before walking directly toward the trash container. I watched quietly from my office downtown as she circled it several times, taking photographs from different angles. Then she crouched beside the decorative edging, apparently searching for something that would support whatever claim she intended to make. She never crossed onto my porch or attempted to enter the house, but she spent nearly 10 minutes examining every visible inch of the installation before returning to her vehicle. The cameras recorded everything with crystal clear detail. That evening, another envelope appeared in my mailbox. This one contained a notice demanding that I remove what the compliance committee described as an unauthorized permanent alteration within 5 business days or face escalating fines. I read every page carefully before opening my laptop. Attached to the notice was a printed copy of the Homeowners Association guideline they claimed I had violated. There was only one problem. The section they highlighted referred specifically to decorative retaining walls exceeding 24 inches in height. My installation was not a retaining wall. It was not even visible above ground. Curious, I downloaded the current version of the association handbook directly from the neighborhood website. The language in the official document differed from the photocopy included in my notice. Entire sentences had been highlighted out of context, making the rule appear broader than it actually was. I printed both versions and placed them side by side. The difference was impossible to miss. Whether intentional or careless, someone had presented the rule in a way that changed its meaning. The next morning, I sent a courteous email to the association board requesting clarification and attached photographs from the county inspection along with the inspector's written confirmation that the installation complied with all applicable regulations. I copied every board member individually instead of sending it only to the compliance committee. By late afternoon, 3 members had replied. 2 thanked me for providing the documentation because they had not previously seen the county report. 1 admitted that the compliance notice had been prepared before the inspection results became available. Only Vanessa remained silent. Over the weekend, another motion alert arrived shortly after sunset. This time the streetlights had already switched on, casting long shadows across the sidewalks. Vanessa's Escalade slowed near my driveway once again. She stepped out carrying a flashlight, even though the area was already well illuminated. She walked around the trash container, paused near the decorative edging, and spent several minutes studying the installation before taking additional photographs. She never touched anything. She simply kept searching for a flaw that did not exist. Watching the footage later that night, I realized something important. Weeks earlier, Vanessa had been completely confident. Now every decision she made looked different. She was no longer enforcing rules. She was searching for a way to justify assumptions that reality had already disproved. Every inspection failed. Every complaint produced more documentation. Every visit created another recording. Without realizing it, she had stopped building a case against me and had begun building one against herself. Monday evening's Homeowners Association board meeting turned out to be very different from the ones I had attended in previous years. Usually, only a handful of residents showed up, listened politely to landscaping updates and budget reports, then went home before sunset. This time, nearly every chair in the clubhouse was occupied. Word travels surprisingly fast through a neighborhood when people begin sensing that someone has finally challenged a system they quietly disliked for years. I arrived carrying a simple folder instead of a stack of complaints. Inside were the inspection report from the county, printed still images from my security cameras, copies of every violation notice I had received over the previous year, and a timeline that connected each notice to the Tuesday morning recordings. I had spent the weekend organizing everything in chronological order because facts become much harder to dismiss when they tell their own story. Vanessa sat at the front table beside the other board members wearing the same calm expression she always displayed during meetings. At first glance, nothing about her suggested concern. She greeted residents with practiced professionalism, shuffled paperwork into neat piles, and smiled whenever someone thanked the board for maintaining neighborhood standards. If I had never lived there, I probably would have believed every word she said. The meeting began with routine business. but it did not stay routine for long. During the homeowner comment period, I stood and requested permission to present information regarding repeated compliance notices issued against my property. The board president nodded, giving me 5 minutes. I walked to the front of the room, connected my laptop to the projector, and displayed a simple calendar showing 8 consecutive Tuesdays. There were no dramatic headlines, no accusations, just dates and times. Then I played the first video. The room remained silent as the white Escalade drifted toward the curb and the trash container tipped onto the pavement. I played the second recording, then the third, then the fourth. Every clip showed nearly the same sequence from slightly different weeks. Finally, I displayed the violation notices that had arrived after each incident. The dates lined up almost perfectly. A quiet murmur spread across the audience. One board member leaned closer to the screen, while another reached for the printed documents I had provided before the meeting. Vanessa interrupted for the first time, suggesting that the recordings merely showed an unfortunate driving mistake repeated under similar circumstances. Instead of responding emotionally, I advanced to the next slide. It contained the county inspection report confirming that my property modification complied fully with local regulations, followed immediately by the altered guideline excerpt attached to the compliance notice. Then I placed the official version of the same rule beside it. The highlighted language did not match. Several people in the room began comparing the printed copies for themselves. One elderly resident near the back quietly raised his hand. "That happened to me 2 years ago," he said. "The rule quoted in my warning letter never looked quite right either." Before anyone could respond, another homeowner stood. Then another. A couple explained how they had received repeated notices about a small decorative bench that previous boards had approved years earlier. A retired teacher described receiving violation letters while recovering from surgery because her recycling container remained outside until the following morning. A young family recalled being fined over a portable basketball hoop that had only been outside while neighborhood children played together on a Saturday afternoon. None of these stories sounded dramatic by themselves. Together, they revealed something much larger. The room slowly transformed from a routine homeowners association meeting into a conversation about consistency, fairness, and accountability. I looked around the clubhouse and realized I was no longer standing there alone. People who had spent years avoiding conflict were finally comparing experiences openly because someone had placed objective evidence on the table first. The discussion shifted away from my driveway entirely. Instead, residents began asking how compliance decisions were documented, who approved warning letters before they were mailed, and why inspection results were apparently ignored when they contradicted earlier accusations. Several board members looked genuinely surprised by the questions because they had trusted the paperwork placed in front of them without examining how it had been prepared. Vanessa attempted to regain control by suggesting the board continue the discussion privately at a later date, but the atmosphere had already changed. Curiosity had replaced assumption. Documentation had replaced rumor. As the meeting finally adjourned nearly an hour later than scheduled, I packed my folder and headed toward the exit. Behind me, small groups of neighbors remained inside the clubhouse, talking quietly instead of leaving immediately as they usually did. For the first time since this entire situation began, the story no longer belonged to just me and Vanessa. It belonged to an entire community that had finally started asking questions no one had dared to ask before. The morning after the board meeting, Pine Creek Estates felt different in a way that had nothing to do with landscaping or property values. People who usually waved from a distance now stopped to talk. Neighbors who had spent years keeping their opinions to themselves suddenly began comparing letters, dates, and old emails. It was as though one unlocked door had quietly revealed a hallway that had always been there. Before leaving for work, I found 2 envelopes tucked beneath my front door. Neither had a return address. Inside the first was a photocopy of an old compliance notice issued to another homeowner nearly 3 years earlier. The second contained handwritten notes listing dates when several residents believed warning letters had been approved before any inspections actually took place. I did not know who had delivered them, but I understood why they had remained anonymous. Fear does not disappear overnight simply because someone asks the first difficult question. That afternoon, my email inbox filled faster than it ever had before. One family shared photographs showing their approved backyard fence receiving violation notices months after construction had already passed inspection. Another resident forwarded archived meeting minutes that mentioned policy changes which never appeared in the official handbook distributed to homeowners. A retired accountant named Susan Harper asked whether I would look at several annual financial reports because some line items seemed unusually vague. None of these documents proved misconduct by themselves, but together they painted a picture of a compliance process that often relied on assumptions instead of verification. Rather than drawing conclusions, I organized every file into separate folders labeled by date, source, and subject. Engineering had trained me to separate evidence from opinion, and I intended to treat this exactly the same way. By Friday evening, 3 members of the Homeowners Association Board requested a special executive session to review recent complaints and supporting documentation. The meeting was announced through the community email system with a brief statement promising greater transparency. That single word seemed to capture everyone's attention. On the night of the session, the clubhouse parking lot filled long before the scheduled start time. Residents stood outside in small groups, speaking quietly, not with anger, but with curiosity. Inside, the atmosphere felt remarkably calm. There were no raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, only stacks of binders, printed reports, and people who suddenly wanted clear answers. One board member began by acknowledging that the county inspection had confirmed my property complied with all applicable regulations. Another explained that several compliance notices issued over recent years would be reviewed to ensure they accurately reflected association policy. Then something unexpected happened. The board secretary projected internal correspondence onto the meeting room screen after receiving legal approval to discuss administrative procedures. The emails showed multiple occasions when board members had requested additional verification before certain warning letters were sent. In several instances, those requests had never been answered. Instead, notices had gone out anyway. Nobody accused anyone of wrongdoing. The documents simply spoke for themselves. Vanessa remained unusually quiet throughout most of the discussion. When asked about the differing versions of the guideline excerpt included with my notice, she explained that she had relied on an older reference packet maintained by the compliance committee. Another board member immediately produced the officially adopted handbook showing updated language that had been in effect for more than 2 years. The room fell silent as both documents were placed side by side. The difference was impossible to overlook. It became increasingly clear that procedures had drifted away from the rules they were supposed to enforce. The board voted unanimously to suspend all pending compliance actions until an independent review of recent enforcement decisions could be completed. They also approved the formation of a homeowner advisory committee made up of volunteers from different sections of the neighborhood. To my surprise, several residents nominated me to participate because they believed my documentation had helped expose weaknesses without turning the issue into a personal attack. I accepted on one condition. Every future decision had to be supported by written evidence that any homeowner could review. The motion passed without objection. As the meeting ended, Vanessa gathered her folders slowly, avoiding the conversations happening around her. Nobody celebrated. Nobody mocked her. The mood inside the clubhouse was far more thoughtful than triumphant because everyone understood the real goal had never been embarrassing one person. It had always been restoring trust in a process that affected every family living behind those entrance signs. Walking back to my truck beneath the glow of the parking lot lights, I realized the trash container had become almost irrelevant. It had never truly been about plastic, wheels, or curbside placement. It had simply been the first loose thread. Once people started pulling on it carefully, they discovered the entire fabric needed to be rewoven. 3 months later, Tuesday mornings looked almost exactly the way they had before all of this began, and somehow they looked completely different at the same time. The sun still climbed over the rooftops just after 6. Sprinklers still clicked methodically across freshly cut lawns. The garbage truck still rumbled into Pine Creek Estates on the same schedule it had followed for years. My black trash container still waited beside the curb in the exact spot where I had placed it every Monday evening. The only thing missing was the sound that had started this entire story. There was no hollow crash of plastic against concrete. No scattered trash blowing across my driveway. No white Escalade drifting toward the curb as though the neighborhood belonged to one person alone. Instead, every vehicle passed at a respectful distance. almost as if the entire street had silently agreed that some habits deserved to stay in the past. The independent review concluded 6 weeks after the special board meeting. The final report stretched across dozens of pages and examined hundreds of compliance records from previous years. Several enforcement procedures were rewritten to require documented evidence before violation notices could be issued. Every future inspection would now include photographs, written verification, and review by more than one board member before penalties could be approved. Homeowners gained access to a transparent appeal process, and meeting records became available for every resident to review instead of remaining buried in filing cabinets. The advisory committee met once each month, and for the first time since I had moved into the neighborhood, discussions centered on solving problems instead of assigning blame. Vanessa resigned from the compliance committee before the review officially concluded. The board accepted her resignation without public criticism, choosing instead to focus on rebuilding trust rather than extending conflict. A different volunteer stepped into the position, someone who believed the purpose of neighborhood rules was to help neighbors live together rather than compete against one another. I never celebrated Vanessa's departure because, somewhere along the way, I realized that victory measured by another person's embarrassment never lasts very long. Real success comes when the system itself becomes fair enough that the same problem cannot quietly happen again. One Saturday afternoon, Tom Reynolds walked across the street carrying a small apple pie his wife had baked. We sat on lawn chairs near my driveway while children rode bicycles up and down the block, laughing without paying attention to property lines or committee meetings. Tom looked toward the trash container, standing exactly where it always had, and smiled. "Funny," he said. "It used to be the most controversial thing in the neighborhood. Now nobody even notices it." I laughed because he was right. The strongest solutions often disappear into everyday life once they begin working. Lily started her junior year of high school that fall, and Noah joined the middle school robotics club after deciding engineering looked more interesting than he had once believed. Every now and then they joked about the famous trash can that somehow became part of neighborhood history. I always reminded them that it was never really about the container. It was about paying attention when something feels wrong, collecting facts instead of assumptions, and remembering that patience often accomplishes what anger never can. A few weeks before the holidays, I opened the storage shelf in my garage and found the original folder that had started everything. Inside were the first violation notices, the printed camera photographs, the county inspection report, and the handwritten timeline I had assembled at my kitchen table late one evening. I flipped through the pages slowly before closing the folder and placing it back on the shelf. I kept it, not because I expected to need it again, but because it reminded me that ordinary people do not need the loudest voice in the room to change the outcome. They only need the discipline to let the truth speak clearly enough that everyone else eventually hears it too. Early the following Tuesday morning, I carried my coffee onto the front porch just as the first light reached the tops of the maple trees lining the street. The garbage truck stopped in front of my house, emptied the container, and continued toward the next driveway. I walked down, rolled the container neatly back beside the garage, and paused for a moment before going inside. It looked exactly the way it should have looked from the very beginning. Quiet, ordinary, completely unremarkable. Sometimes justice does not arrive with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it arrives so quietly that the only evidence it was ever needed is the peaceful morning that finally replaces the noise.